I'm Bill Ryan, webmaster for the Flagler Memories Project at the Flagler County Public Library. I visited the Florida Agricultural Museum, which is a work in progress. It's located in the most historic portion of Flagler County, bounded by Pellicer Creek and the Prince's Place Preserve. The concept is to preserve our rich heritage of agriculture. Much activity is in progress by volunteers and museum staff in restoring artifacts, vintage tractors, and farm equipment donated to the museum. Historic structures have been moved into place and are now ready for restoration. Cracker horses and soon Spanish cattle will be grazing on the museum land. Palm Coast Holding Company donated land containing an 18th century British sawmill site. The mill was built during the British occupation prior to the American Revolution. Old Kings Road runs through the property, going northward to a 200-foot coquina stone causeway, leading to Pellicer Creek and the Twin Bridges. I was very fortunate to visit this site with the museum director and news reporters.
And they're putting up a set of stalls in the storage building so that we have a place for the horses and the equipment. Both sides of the street. About
10 acres, you said?
Yeah, and they're donating the 10 acres, and they're also donating all the improvements. So they're going to put a small parking area, stabilized parking area on the road near where we park. And then they're going to put a trail system in here that will be handicap accessible. They're also putting in boardwalks and I'm not sure if you call them bridges, but they're boardwalks over the open part of the creek in areas where you have to, in order to make a loop trail. So you'll come in on this side, go down to the mill site, and then back up on the other side. They're also paying for interpretive signage, basically going to make this a turnkey, usable facility for us. And they're negotiating, and we're talking to them about the possibility of trying to get the mill reconstructed. And although right now that looks like about a $1.2 million process, we've talked to some millwrights up in New England that have experience with recreating these things. So we'll probably try to do it in a phased approach so that we can build the frame of the structure and a roof and then start filling in the wooden mechanical components, because this whole thing was made out of hand wrought wood and cast iron metal fittings and bolts and fasteners. And we think it was constructed about 1770 and then used up to about 1813 and probably burned during the Patriot Wars. There was a lot of, actually what was going on is Spain controlled Florida, and all the English settlers up in Georgia, with some clandestine assistance from the U.S. government, were trying to take over Florida and get the Spanish out. And so they had raiding parties that came in here with under the cover of Native Americans. So the natives got blamed for a lot of stuff that was actually being incited by settlers from Georgia and the U.S. government to try to get the Spanish out. And they looted and burned and tore up the countryside pretty good. And this mill was likely one of the things that they burned. And Hewitt was an important individual in that he did a lot of construction for the Spanish government in St. Augustine and supplied a lot of timber. And during the Revolutionary War, St. Augustine experienced this huge burst of loyalists who were escaping out of Georgia, Virginia, and South Carolina. So they had a huge housing crisis. There just wasn't enough room for people to live. And so I bet he was sawing timber as fast as he could out here to meet the demand for housing. Hog carts, a shop to maintain all the saws, and probably a blacksmith's and carpenter shop, because the maintenance to keep the mill running would have required a lot of work. There would have been logs stored here, sawed lumber being dried out, so it would be ready for market. They would have had wagons, probably heavy-duty wagons, and maybe even floated some of this stuff out on barges to move it to St. Augustine. Slave cabins, because I'm sure most of all this work was done by slaves. So they had to live somewhere. They had to grow food for themselves and for the animals. So there would have been fields out here that they would have been growing hay and maybe some other feed stuff for the oxen and the mules that would have been here doing the labor. So this would have been a busy, active location with a lot of stuff going on and a lot of people living here. The water to the mill would have come through a control gate over there and run through here. The mill would have set down in that low area back in there where all the trees are, actually in the wetlands part of the property. And so there were two wheels on this mill. It was an undershot or flutter wheel. The water ran underneath it. And most people don't think about Florida having sawmills because they just don't think there's enough change in topography like you get in New England. But here it was a case of holding enough volume. So if you had a large enough volume of water, you could run the mill, and it worked quite successfully here. And there were a number of other mill sites in Florida, but this is probably one of the earlier ones that we know of. And the water would run through, it would power the sash saw that went up and down that cut the timber, and it also had a ratchet device that moved the log cart through the saw blade at the same time. That was all water powered. Once you cut off a piece of lumber, you make one run through the saw, you'd have to back the cart up. So there was a running through here is where they borrowed out a lot of the soil from the dam itself. So, this is basically the reverse of what you've got down there. They pulled a lot of the dirt out of here. There's another borrow put on here. Trough in the run. Well, I've got what's called a camp hook that is used to move the log. It's a big wooden stump. Actually, we also have the ratchet arm that was part of the ratchet device that allowed the log cart to be moved. So we've got there's quite a few of the original fasteners and some of the wooden artifacts. What happened, in fact, the timbers from the mill are still here. Part of what we'd want to do before we can do any reconstruction in here is to relocate the mill itself and then build the replica slightly larger so we don't destroy the original mill material. Old Ironsides actually is made from timbers that came out of Florida, and the live oaks were really selected because the way the limbs grew, they twisted, and when they grow, the grain, the reason they have these long arm-like limbs that stick out and touch the ground sometimes, is that the grain twists as it grows, so it's very strong. And they would select pieces that would make the ribs of the ship, and so they would select a tree based on the fact that it had a bend in the wood that was already what they needed. And so they cut those, they set them out, and then haul them down to the creeks, load them on small boats, and then carry them out to large sailing ships like at Ponce Inlet and St. Augustine Inlet. And the live oakers, they were crews that came down out of Massachusetts primarily, from the shipyards up there, and they tried to keep them out in the woods and away from most of the locals, because generally these were a pretty rough group, but I'm sure they had some interaction. But they'd come down and cut timber, and there was a lot of complaints even about live oakers coming out of the Bahamas who were coming in here and working timber. Pine, because it's straight, it's relatively easy to cut, and it's the most productive source of lumber. And at that time we had lots of longleaf pine plantations in this area that have since been cut out with the end of the turpentining activity.
Was that the native pine to this area? So, and now the ones they plant,
the slash
pine,
yeah, that's a genetic variant for selected for fast growth. It's a kind of a created tree. And then we've got sand pines and loblollies.
And that kills the natural longleaf pine, right?
Well, no, the longleaf pines, for the most part, there are small stands that are still left, but most of them worked for turpentine, and then they came back in, and once they weren't productive for getting the sap, the rosin out of them, they'd timber them out. And so they were really, well, in fact, the Princess Place, I'm sure, has probably longleaf pine girders in it that it's a slow growing, for pine it's a pretty hard wood, and the older it gets, you can't drive a nail in the old stuff anymore. You got to drill a hole to put a nail in it,
Right.
and the termites won't even eat it. And we can get, the park will initially, or this part of the museum exhibit area will be opened as a passive facility. We'll have interpretive signs out here, the boardwalks, the trail system, the parking, and we'll have staff that will come over and open it, and we'd like to do some guided tours through here. Then the next phase would really be to do the archaeology at the mill site itself, and probably also to investigate whether or not there's some other archaeological remains that we can better understand scattered in the woods. Then what we'd like to do is look at recreating basically the framework of the mill would be the next phase. So we'd have kind of the framework structure with a roof over it that would give people, a sense of scale and location. And then we'd look at recreating, the spillway, the waterway system in there and the gate, so we can again give people an idea of what this would have looked like. And then the next phase after we get that done would really be to look at recreating the mechanism of the sawmill itself, and then coming up with a way that we could demonstrate water going through it, but probably through some type of recirculating system, so that we're not using a lot of water. And obviously we're not going to dam up the Hewlett's branch again. But as you look back through here, imagine this would over time. The idea here is you'll come along that trail that we basically followed. There'll be what's the other term? Boardwalks across these openings, so that you can loop back around.
And there will be water going underneath those little...
Well, there is now. If we walk all the way out here, Hewitt's branch on the other side of that mound is still running through there. An easier place to see it or photograph it
Yeah, I saw
is
it.
back up on the road.
Yeah.
But there was a complex here of several buildings.
Oh yeah, there probably were. I would guess that there must have been maybe as many as a dozen slave quarters, big pens to store the livestock in. To keep this thing going, when you're talking about having to saw down these big trees by hand, if you got 2 of them over here in a day, you're probably doing pretty stinking good. So, and they could saw 1,500 board feet of lumber. Compared to what they would do with a pit saw, this thing was just amazing in terms of the amount of lumber it could turn out, as long as they had enough water to be shut down for weeks on end, and probably would store up a lot of timber to be cut. And then when it rained enough, they'd fire her back up once the dam, the mill pond filled up enough. Jamestown was founded, St. Augustine was up for redevelopment.
Yeah.
You all good? Structure itself. So they're really going way beyond what they legally have to do in order to preserve and protect the site and to help get it interpreted. So I think it speaks of their community support and interest in history.
So my search for Old Kings Road still continues. It's not completely paved. It still exists in the tree-choked site of Hewitt Sawmill. I know it's there, going northward up to Pellisser Creek. I also have some faith that Flagler's rich heritage has a chance of being preserved for the future. The Agriculture Museum is a very encouraging site, and I wish it well.